When a police officer looks at you during a traffic stop and says, "We called a canine unit," something happens to almost every driver in that moment. They wait. They sit in the car or stand on the pavement, and they wait. Because in that moment, the announcement feels like a verdict. The dog is coming. The search is inevitable. Whatever happens next is already decided. Here is what almost nobody knows. The announcement that a canine unit has been called is not a search warrant. It is not probable cause. It is not legal authority to hold you indefinitely while that unit makes its way to the scene. And the amount of time you can be legally held waiting for that dog is not determined by how long it takes the dog to arrive. It is determined by a Supreme Court ruling that most drivers have never heard of, one that puts a hard legal ceiling on exactly this situation. When you know that ruling, the canine announcement stops being a verdict. It becomes a clock. And the moment you hear those words, you start the clock by saying something that puts the legal timeline on the record before a single minute passes. Today I'm going to show you exactly what is happening legally when an officer calls for a canine, why the wait feels mandatory when it is not, the Supreme Court case that draws the line on how long they can hold you, and the exact words you say the moment you hear that a dog is on the way. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this channel gives you the knowledge that protects you before you are ever in the moment where you need it. Share this with one person before this video ends. Someone who would hear those words and sit there waiting because they did not know they had a question to ask and a clock to start. Here is the reality that most people are never taught. A canine unit is a search tool. It is a dog trained to alert to the presence of specific substances. When a dog alerts, that alert can be used to establish probable cause for a search. This is established law, and it is not what this video is about. What this video is about is the legal question that comes before the dog ever arrives. How long can an officer hold you waiting for it? The answer to that question is not as open-ended as most people believe, and it comes directly from the Supreme Court. In Rodriguez versus United States, decided in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled on exactly this scenario. A driver named Dennis Rodriguez was pulled over in Nebraska for a traffic violation. After the stop was complete, ticket written, documents returned, the officer asked Rodriguez to wait while a canine unit was brought to the scene. Rodriguez refused. The officer made him wait anyway. The dog arrived about 7 to 8 minutes after the stop had concluded its original purpose. The dog alerted. Methamphetamine was found. Rodriguez was charged. The Supreme Court overturned the conviction. The court held that a police stop can last no longer than the time necessary to handle the matter for which the stop was made. Once the purpose of the stop is complete, the officer cannot extend the stop, even by a de minimis amount of time, without independent, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. A traffic stop is not a fishing expedition that can be extended because an officer hopes a dog might find something. The extended detention violated the Fourth Amendment. Everything found during it was the product of an unlawful seizure. In plain English, when the ticket is done, when the documents are back in your hand, when the original purpose of the stop has been resolved, the stop must end. Holding you after that moment to wait for a canine unit requires a new legal basis. Not a hope, not a general suspicion. Independent, articulable facts that constitute reasonable suspicion of a separate crime. This is the legal ceiling. And the words you say the moment a canine is announced put that ceiling on the record before the clock starts running against you. Here is what the bad way looks like. Officer pulls you over for speeding, writes the ticket, returns your documents, then says, "Hold on, we called a canine unit to come by, just sit tight." Driver sits tight. Because the officer said to. Because a dog is coming. Because the situation feels non-negotiable. 12 minutes pass. The dog arrives, walks the exterior of the vehicle, alerts. The car is searched. The driver never knew they could say anything. They never knew the stop had legally ended the moment those documents were returned. They never knew that the 12-minute wait was not a routine inconvenience. It was an unconstitutional extension of a completed stop. And they never said a word that would have put any of that on the record. Here is what the good way looks like. Officer pulls you over, writes the ticket, returns the documents, says, "Hold on, we called a canine, just sit tight." The driver says this immediately and calmly. "Officer, my documents have been returned and the purpose of this stop appears to be complete. Am I being detained beyond the purpose of this stop? And if so, what is the independent legal basis for my continued detention?" One sentence. Calm. Direct. No attitude. That sentence does three things simultaneously. It establishes on the body cam that the original purpose of the stop was complete at the moment the question was asked. It creates a documented timestamp of when the extension began. And it forces the officer to either state a specific, articulable legal basis for the continued detention, or acknowledge that no such basis exists. If the officer has independent reasonable suspicion, something they observed, something specific and articulable, they will state it. You now know where you stand, and you comply with the lawful detention. If the officer does not have independent reasonable suspicion, every minute of the wait that follows your question is documented as occurring after you asserted your right to leave. That documentation is your attorney's foundation for a suppression motion, if this ever goes to court. Drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever been held at a traffic stop waiting for a K-9 unit without knowing you had a question to ask? Tell me how long you waited. I want to know the numbers because I guarantee they are going to be significant. If you are still here, hit the like button right now, because the next section is where this becomes specific. What happens in the different scenarios that follow your question, and how to handle each one without saying anything that undermines what you just put on the record. Here is what happens after you ask that question. Scenario 1. The officer states an independent basis for detention. They say something like, I am detaining you because I observed nervousness consistent with concealment, or I noticed an odor I am trained to recognize, or I have information from dispatch about this vehicle. Whether or not you agree with the basis, one exists and has been stated. You comply with the detention. You say, I understand. I do not consent to any searches of my vehicle or my person. Then you say nothing else. The detention may be lawful. The search that follows still requires either your consent, which you have now declined, or independent probable cause established by the dog's alert or some other factor. Scenario 2. The officer does not state an independent basis. They say something like, it is just standard procedure, or the dog is already on the way, or it will only be a few minutes. None of those are a legal basis for detention. You have asked. They have not answered with a specific, articulable reason. You say this, I want to make sure this is on the record. I asked whether there is an independent legal basis for my continued detention, and I have not received a specific answer. I do not consent to any searches of my vehicle or my person. Then you say nothing else. You do not physically leave if the officer has not confirmed you are free to go. You do not touch the vehicle or attempt to drive away. You remain calm, you remain still, and you let what is happening be documented on the body cam exactly as it is. Scenario 3. The officer says you are free to go. This happens more often than people expect in the wake of a direct, calm, legally grounded question. You say, thank you, officer, and you leave. Immediately after you drive away, you record a voice memo. The time, the location, the officer's information, what was said, what you said, how long the stop lasted, what happened. That record is your attorney's starting point if any of this ever becomes relevant. In all three scenarios, the one thing that never changes is the first sentence. The moment you hear that a K-9 has been called, you say, Officer, my documents have been returned, and the purpose of this stop appears to be complete. Am I being detained beyond the purpose of this stop? And if so, what is the independent legal basis for my continued detention? That sentence is the clock starting on the record. Let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin is 26 years old, lives in Ohio, and was pulled over on a state route for a rolling stop at a sign. The officer issued a warning, returned his license and registration, and then said, we have a K-9 coming. I am going to need you to stay put. Kevin stayed. For 22 minutes. He sat in his car and waited because the officer told him to, and he did not know he had any other option. The dog arrived, walked the exterior, did not alert. Kevin was told he could go. 22 minutes. After a warning for a rolling stop. After his documents had been returned. After the legal purpose of the stop was complete. Kevin's uncle, who had some legal background, heard about the stop and explained to Kevin what the Rodriguez ruling said. Kevin realized that the entire 22-minute wait had occurred after the stop's legal purpose was concluded. That every minute of it was a detention that required independent justification. Justification that was never stated and may not have existed. Nothing had been found. Kevin had not been charged. But he had given up 22 minutes of his time and his freedom on the side of a road. And he had done it in silence because nobody had ever told him he had a sentence to say. Kevin now knows the sentence. After this video, so do you. There are two cases that make everything in this video legally exact. The first is Terry versus Ohio from 1968. The court established that any detention, however brief, requires reasonable articulable suspicion. This is the foundational requirement. It applies to the original stop, and it applies to any extension of the stop. The officer must have specific articulable facts, not a feeling, not a hope, Facts that can be stated out loud and evaluated by a court. The second is Rodriguez versus United States from 2015. This is the controlling case for everything covered in this video. The court held that a traffic stop cannot be extended beyond the time reasonably required to complete its original mission without independent reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. A canine walk is not part of the original mission of a speeding stop. A canine walk is an investigation, and investigations require their own legal foundation. Every minute you are held waiting for a dog after the purpose of your stop is complete is a minute of detention that requires that foundation to be lawful. When you know these two cases, the canine announcement goes from feeling like the end of your options to being the beginning of a legal record you are actively creating in real time. Here is the complete recap of everything you now know. A canine announcement is not probable cause, not a warrant, and not authority to hold you indefinitely. The legal ceiling on how long you can be held comes from Rodriguez versus United States, which says the stop ends when its purpose ends, and everything after that requires independent, reasonable suspicion. The moment you hear that a canine has been called, you say, "Officer, my documents have been returned, and the purpose of this stop appears to be complete. Am I being detained beyond the purpose of this stop? And if so, what is the independent legal basis for my continued detention?" Calm voice, no attitude. One sentence that starts the clock on the record. If the officer states an independent basis, you acknowledge it and state your non-consent to any searches. If the officer does not state an independent basis, you repeat your non-consent and let the body cam document exactly what is happening. If the officer says you are free to go, you leave and immediately record a voice memo of everything that occurred. Think about one person in your life right now. Someone who has sat on the side of a road waiting for a dog because an officer told them to stay, and they did not know they had a sentence to say. Share this video with them today, not later, right now before you close this tab. The sentence you just learned takes 5 seconds to say, and it could be the difference between 22 minutes on a state route and a drive home. Next week, I am breaking down what happens when an officer says you are not under arrest, but tells you to come with them to the station voluntarily. That word, voluntarily, is doing more legal work in that sentence than most people ever realize. And what you say before you take a single step determines whether your rights survive the ride. Subscribe so you catch it the day it drops. Hit the like button if the Rodriguez ruling just changed how you understand every canine announcement you will ever hear. Drop a comment right now telling me whether you knew before today that a completed traffic stop has a legal endpoint that a canine wait cannot cross without independent justification. I read every single comment. I want to see how many people this is landing on for the first time. Know your rights. Use them. Stay safe.